we get three primary questions from the dollarati, as I call them. These people come in there. Well, the federal bank, the central bank, is a Rothschilds. It's a private thing, man. We're in debt. We're owned by the Rothschilds. Rothschilds own America, and so all of a sudden we lose any potential of talking about policy space. We immediately lose any potential of talking about the realities of federal financing. We lose all the space because they're busy chasing after some phantom. Talk to us a little bit about the history of the Federal Reserve and what its function is, as opposed to 1913, what it is today. What do we have here? Talk to our followers here about what the Federal Reserve is and is not.
Sure. And I'd just like to sort of re-emphasize, I completely agree with what you're saying about learning a bit of the technicals and this being the sort of substantive meat. Now, I think the heart is still where politics is always with people and actual suffering, but I think it's very important to deal with the world and the way that it works. And that includes understanding institutions, social institutions, and legal institutions, and how they structure society. People say the wheels of justice turn slowly but exceedingly fine. Institutional dynamics may work subtly, but they work exceedingly fine over history. And it's important to understand how they affect politics, because otherwise it's like bending a young willow. You can do it in the short run, but over time it bends itself back, or the water that over time erodes stone. So it's very important to understand those dynamics as well. Now, when it comes to this issue about the Rothschilds, the first thing I want to say is it's worth separating out political power and institutional formal structure. So you can have, to use that Disney Aladdin movie, you can have the Sultan sitting on the throne and you can have Jafar standing next to him. And you can have two people standing in front of them arguing for an hour about whether the Sultan is in charge or Jafar is in charge. But what it turns out is you're really asking different questions. One is, who is the person whose signature goes on the decisions that get made? And the other person is saying, who has the power to influence the content of those decisions? So those are two very different and related, obviously, questions, but it's important to know which question is being asked so that people don't argue over those answers. Now, when it comes to the Federal Reserve, I think 50 or 60% of the disagreement ends up often being about the fact that one person is trying to have a conversation about one of those questions and the other person wants to give the answer to the other question because they think that's the more important thing to be talking about. So to the question of whether there are things like private power, I think that is absolutely the case. There are private power. I obviously don't think it's the Rothschilds sitting in some high tower in Transylvania or something, but I think it's important to talk about how even when there are public institutions, those institutions can be subject to the influence of private power. And I don't think you need to go further than debates over, for example, campaign finance to see how you can do that perfectly well. These are public elections, but they are being run by private entities. When it comes to the Fed, however, the argument often seeps over into the idea that there are structural ownership claims. So it's not just that the Fed is a captured institution by private interests in the way that I might say the FCC is captured by the telecom industries or the FDA is captured by the pharmaceutical industries. That's not the claim that often gets made. The claim is stronger than that, which is that the Fed is actually legally owned by private entities. And that is, I think, silly. And I think that's your point as well, and I'm happy to explain why.
Yes, so please.
So first of all, as a lawyer, there are multiple layers of law. In the same way as the MMTers talk about the hierarchy, your personal IOU is money, and on the other hand, a bank IOU is money, and on the other hand, a government IOU is money, but they are different kinds of money, and they have different sort of spheres of circulation and uses and things. There are different levels of law. You can say something is illegal because of a regulation. You can say something is illegal because of a statute, and you can say something is illegal because it is unconstitutional. Those are different claims at different levels of the system, right? So when you're talking about the Fed, one thing that you could say is that when it comes to ownership, all property rights have to be sanctioned by the state. So there is always ultimately state sanction on any private activity that is considered legal, because by definition, if it wasn't sanctioned, it wouldn't be legal. So it's to say, for example, private entities own all of the wealth is to say that we have given private entities property rights that we recognize over that wealth. When it comes to the Federal Reserve, the first thing to note is that, legally speaking, it is created by an act of Congress. There is a thing called the Federal Reserve Act. Now, the Federal Reserve Act is not the only institution that establishes the legal basis for the Federal Reserve. There is also the very basis of corporate law, which was a government legal institution originally founded basically like private-public partnerships. They were royal grants of a charter to entities to do things on behalf of the government. So you wanted to have ships get spices from India, you create a corporation. The king signs a royal charter and a corporation gets formed and goes and does it. Over time, that corporation starts to declare its independence, says I should have some rights to do things separate to the interests of the crown, blah, blah, blah. Over time, they widen the sphere of things that can be corporations. And then eventually you have this idea that there is private interest alongside public interest in the corporate form. So the entities that we would call banks are chartered corporations with special banking privileges. They still today, and Robert Hockett and Sal Leoma Rover at Cornell Law School wrote a great piece called The Finance Franchise, and another great piece called Special, Vestigial, or Visionary, what the banking charter can tell us about the corporate form and vice versa, or maybe it's vice versa. But both of those pieces look at the origins of private banking corporations in public grants of legal discretion. That is to say, banks emerged from the state, legally speaking. Just like private corporations did more generally. Banks are a special subset of corporations. One of the points that Hockett and Omarova make is the very nature of banks as an industry means that today their public-private partnership nature is much more visible than most other corporations. So the very fact that banks still have a special banking license and are subject to regulatory oversight and get access to the central bank for their discount window, all of those things are recognizing that banks are not just private actors like you and me. They are explicitly public-private partnerships or syntheses, what Hockett and Omarova would call a franchisee of government authority. So before you even get to the Fed and its relationship to banks, it's important to note that both banks and the Fed, the structure of those institutions are creatures of the state. Then the question is, who owns what? Who directs what? And the common refrain is, well, the Federal Reserve is comprised of a series of regional banks. Those federal regional banks have member banks, like your local bowling club has local members, right? And those member banks own the regional bank, so that the whole network is made up of a series of regional banks that are owned by member private banks. Because those banks are private, they say the Fed itself must be private. Then, of course, there is the fact that the most important entity in the Federal Reserve System today is not any of those regional banks, but the Federal Open Market Committee, which is based in Washington, D.C., and is got membership from presidents of those banks, but is a separate institution, just like you may have a national sorority or fraternity society that's made up of local chapter presidents, but that doesn't mean that the national level is simply being directed by the member, by each local membership organization. Now, the reason that this argument hasn't been able to be killed definitively is because the law is, and law sometimes does this, misleading. The law was created in a way that gives the impression of private ownership at a very formalistic level, even as discretionary control is not exercised at that level. And I'm, of course, talking here about the stock ownership of the bank, of the regional banks. So if you look in the Federal Reserve Act, one thing you can see is that private regional banks, when they become members of their regional Fed, pay in, so to speak, and they get shares in that bank. So the logic people think is, well, if I buy shares in a company, I own that company. Therefore, if there's banks buying shares in a regional Fed, the bank must own the Fed. The reason that's not true is because those shares don't operate like regular shares, and even if they did, the banks don't operate like regular banks. So those shares, what they really are, functionally speaking, is they're a way for banks to get return on dividends and to pay for the cost of operating the Fed. Now, those two amounts, whether they get more in or less in, those could be varied. What the Federal Reserve regional banks wanted was to have both of those powers, the power to demand money from them and the power to suck money back out. Now, if you think about it logically, of course it's better to have both powers because you can always just not use one. Whereas if you just had the power to suck out money, or if you just had the power to give them, you could still vary them like a temperature knob, but you wouldn't be able to have as much variation in both directions. So by saying, look, you have to pay in almost like a tax on banks, and then on the other hand, you get dividends out, stop complaining as long as we make sure the dividends are pretty good for you. So in the statute, it says average dividends are going to be something like 6%, and they get this like clockwork on that stock. So it's sort of like putting your hat in the ring and keeping it there so that you've got some skin in the game. The other part is that the history of the Federal Reserve goes back before 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was founded, and it had its origins in a network of private banks. So one can trace a story of the development of the Federal Reserve as one of increasing public ownership over the private banking network. So you can imagine the government allowing private banks to emerge, both at the federal and the state level, and then those banks developing sort of effectively network effects, and then the federal government taking over those network effects with the 1860 Federal Banking Act and keeping them. What happened at the late 20th century was and the banks started not trusting each other, and there was a sort of systemic breakdown like we saw in '08, and the banks stepped in and created their own mini central bank and said, look, we'll provide our own liquidity and we'll let each other settle all of our debts off against each other, and in doing so, we'll avert this calamity and we'll stay in control. And Chase at one point in the early 20th century was even the Treasury Secretary, so there was this sort of revolving door between the people at the top of the banking system and running the government. So there was definitely cronyism, there was definitely private interest involved, there was definitely corruption. Those claims about the sort of influence are not false. But technically speaking, the 1913 Federal Reserve Act was a creature of Congress, and it established a set of public institutions that, although they had on paper shareholder banks, were ultimately subject to government control. That said, that creation was a political compromise with financial interests at the time. So it was explicitly designed, and Peter Conti Brown, the legal professor, is a very good historian on this. He just wrote a whole book on it, I highly recommend, called The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve. When it was created, it was explicitly a sort of compromise with private banking interests. So in the same way as you can look at the Obamacare Act, the Affordable Care Act, and see it as a sort of compromise with private medical interests, the Federal Reserve Act was a compromise in a way of saying you get to sort of have some power that we're not going to take over. What became clear over time was that the most important power was the power over interest rates, and that increasingly got centralized. So at the beginning, those regional banks were public institutions, but they were mostly staffed by private banking interests. And then those private banking interests had an alternative power base against which they fought in Washington, D.C. with the Federal Open Market Committee. And that Federal Open Market Committee ended up winning that fight in 1935, which at that point, the decisions to set interest rates were made exclusively, effectively in DC. Now, that fight was fought mostly between the New York Fed and the DC Fed, because the New York Fed was the one responsible for doing most trades involving Treasury debt. So they were the ones, like we were talking about QE earlier, they were the ones that were monitoring and controlling the membrane between Treasury debt and cash, and how much gets to slip through one way and how much gets to slip through the other way. They retained control in DC, even as they might have had banking interests, play in their policy decisions. And the big fight then came, funnily enough, between the DC board and the Treasury. So as I was saying, if you can imagine this sort of history of an increasing of taking of private banking power and moving it closer to the public institutions, the creation of the Fed was a step forward in that trajectory. And then the creation of the Federal Open Market Committee on top of the regional banks was a step forward in that process. And then the fight between the Federal Open Market Committee and the Treasury Department was a step forward in that. It was bringing this power closer and closer to, the President and the Treasury Secretary. And what happened was the Treasury Secretary said, it's war. And because it's war, we want to make sure we're not paying too much interest on the national debt, because paying interest on that debt is effectively giving fiscal subsidies to owners of that debt. They're just getting interest for holding out, for lending us cash and getting a cash-like instrument in return. So keep the interest rates pegged at 2.25% at the very long end, and keep it pegged at something like 0.3% at the very short rate. So what this did was make very clear that those interest rates were a policy decision of the Federal Open Market Committee. If they said, we want long rates to be 2% and we want short rates to be 3/8, they had the tools, they had the power with their buying and selling, because of that infinity sign, to back that up. And the markets didn't fight them. The market said, look, we know you can back it up. We're not going to go fight. It's like a computer game where there's an evil character that's invincible because he's important to the storyline. You don't keep trying to attack him. You just move on. They didn't keep trying to fight the Fed. When the Fed said the interest rate is 2%, it stayed there. Of course, the bankers hated this for two reasons. One, 2% is not that much interest. And two, it makes it very clear that the private bond market is not financing the government. Because what you're effectively doing is the central bank says we're going to ensure that the interest rate is 2% because we're going to buy any single treasury bond you don't want at 2%. And so it became very clear that the private bond market was just a pass-through between the Treasury and the Fed. And it made the bond market sort of mystical power to put their thumb up or down on the economy based on how much they liked the policy of the government in power, the sort of referendum on the government by the market. It rendered that myth a complete farce. It pulled back the curtain. And so what happened was there was a very bitter fight between the Truman administration. After the war, the Fed said, okay, the war's over, let us take control of the reins again. And Truman said, nah, we actually like this because this is cheaper for us. We can get more schools and bridges and, yes, unfortunately, bombs and planes, fighter planes. Just every time we had to spend $1 on public services. Now we're paying 5 cents of interest. This is a way better deal for us. Let's keep it this way. Thank you very much. And the Fed said, "Oh, no. Sorry. We have to have it. We have to have the market determined because the market needs to be able to exercise some discipline on the government and show whether it has confidence in the government spending." And so, what happened was this was a really big fight. It wasn't a fight between private banks and the government. It was a fight between bureaucrats in the Federal Reserve who were loyal to banking interests, and bureaucrats in the Treasury who were loyal to the kind of populist administration of Truman at the time. So it was an intra-public sector fight. Of course, there were different interests being represented, but it wasn't the Rothschilds sitting, in their Donald Trump tower down at Wall Street. It was the Federal Reserve Bank at Wall Street having a fight. And it was like a movie plot, says Aaron in the comments. It was like a movie plot because this fight played out on the front page of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. The Treasury Secretary and the chairman of the Fed were actively fighting each other. And the Fed was saying, you've put us in a straitjacket because our mandate is for price stability, but you are forcing us to keep these interest rates low, which is causing inflation. So you've tied our hands behind our back, can't do our jobs. That was the party line in the Fed. And what the Truman administration said was, BS. We call BS on that. If you wanted to curb inflation, you could curb inflation by making credit harder to issue. So to speak, financial repression or credit rationing or qualitative credit controls. So in the same way there was quantitative easing, you could have qualitative tightening. And the idea here was a bank making a $500 million loan to a casino in Nevada is not just taking $500 million of someone's savings and spending it. It's not just sort of taking money from someone's pocket that's sitting idle and spending it. It is actively creating new purchasing power. It is actively creating new credit that functions like money, bank deposits. And so what the Truman administration knew, they were sort of sniffing a rat here, and the Fed didn't want to acknowledge, is that when it comes to inflation, it's just as inflationary to allow a casino to get a $500 million loan as it is to allow $500 million to be spent on childcare or on bombs even. Obviously, when I say it's just as inflationary, I'm not saying that any $500 million is going to have an equal effect no matter how you spend it. It obviously matters how you spend it. But the point is there were real resources being used in the when you give someone a bank loan that contribute to full resource usage in the same way as real resources get used when the federal government spends. So Truman's point was, if we have to start cutting somewhere, if we're at sort of full employment and we're at an inflationary economy, we're sort of overheated, as you're telling me, Mr. Federal Reserve, or Mrs. Federal Reserve now, if that's what the problem is, then let's start dampening by first turning to private credit rather than cutting public spending. So the idea here is, the sort of joke that the joke about Catholics that nobody weeps for an unfertilized sperm. The idea here is nobody weeps for a loan that never gets made, right? Nobody weeps when there were only 8 new casinos built, not 9. Nobody knows what nobody knows what that potential would be, and the idea is that private loans don't have a right to exist any more than public education has a right to exist. Prima facie. We think it has a right because we've agreed on it. But nobody sat down as a political community and said, do we want more casinos than we want public spending? People know that if there's inflation, we have to cut spending. And Truman's point was, let's start with private bank lending. And the Federal Reserve obviously hated this. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to countenance this. And by the way, this whole conversation, if you want to learn more about this, there is a great article on the Richmond Fed's website called The Treasury Fed Accord, a New Narrative Account by Hetzel and Leach. And it goes into detail about this from accounts of people who were there. This fight going on, and it went to the front cover of the New York Times, and eventually Truman lost, in part because he was dealing with other issues at the time, notably the Korean War, and he didn't have enough political capital to keep fighting on every front. So before we even get to why he lost this issue, if he hadn't been dealing with other issues, it's possible he could have won this issue and we would have a very different Federal Reserve System than we had today. But he lost this issue, and the reason he lost this issue was because one of the people involved in the Treasury's team, a man named William McChesney Martin, basically double-crossed him. So they were saying, how are we going to fight the Fed? How are we going to keep this fight up? And McChesney Martin, the Treasury Secretary, a guy named Snyder at the time, who was very loyal to Truman, was willing to go head-to-head with the Fed. He said, stuff you. I'm just going to say no. And the Fed started making announcements behind the Treasury's back. So the Treasury said, we're not going to announce an increase. And the Fed said, oh, yes, there's an increase coming. And there was this sort of misdirection, like we're sort of seeing in the Trump administration now, with different agencies fighting and things. And so what happened was the Treasury Secretary said, I can't work with the chairman of the Fed. Now, the Fed chairman is put in for 8 years or 7 years and can't be removed except for cause. So the president can't just fire the Fed chairman. But, and this is the magic of good legal thinking, if the Treasury Secretary says, I can't work with the Fed chairman has to resign. This is one of these sort of gentleman's arrangements when it comes to how bureaucracies work. Because technically the Fed chairman is under the Treasury Secretary. So if the Treasury Secretary says, I can't work with my underling, the underling is supposed to resign. In the same way as bureaucrats resign when a new president comes in and gives the president a choice of hiring them back. So the Federal Reserve was losing at this point in the battle. And the Federal Reserve was about to lose its chairman, and they were going to appoint one of their own guys and say, fine, we'll just fight another day. And William McChesney Martin on the Treasury side, and of this almost kind of serendipitous moment in history where the Treasury Secretary had to go into hospital for an operation. So he was MIA for a couple of days. And McChesney Martin basically called the Fed and said, I'm going to broker a deal. I'm going to make peace. I'm going to do my Middle East peace talks and become the hero of this story by sort of putting mum and dad, back together again. And so he, God knows what he said on those phone calls, but he eventually came to Snyder and said, look, here's the idea, here's the plan. We'll let them get control back over long-term rates. So we'll agree that the decision of what long-term rates are going to be is up to the Fed. In exchange, we'll put one of our guys in power. So yes, we'll hand over the power back from the Treasury to the Fed, but in exchange, it'll be our guys at the Fed. So who cares? They said, okay, well, I guess that's going to be the same thing. The only thing better than defeating the enemy is putting a puppet as its leader. Sure. And who did they pick? Well, the mastermind of the plan himself, William McChesney Martin. It's like Dick Cheney doing a VP search and deciding that actually he was the best guy for the job. So William McChesney Martin was appointed as the first Fed after this accord. And what did he do immediately after? He announced his full and firm support for raising interest rates in order to combat inflation, which was the goal of the Fed. That is to say, he immediately touted the banker party line. And there's a line in that article, which I'm glad you linked to everybody, from the Richmond Fed by Hetzel and Leach at the very end, that notes, after this all happened and the dust settled with Truman and Korea and everything, William McChesney Martin was walking down the street in D.C., and Truman was walking down the street, and Truman saw McChesney Martin, called him a traitor, and walked to the other side of the road and kept walking. So when you ask me this question about, is the Fed owned by private interests? On one hand, yeah, there's private interests, banker interests. Look at Wall Street running the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party. So yeah, private banker interests are abound. But when you ask me, is the Fed a private institution? I say, of course not. The Federal Reserve Act established it. The banks that are members in inverted commas are also publicly chartered institutions. And the people who run the Fed are bureaucrats who have independence from the Treasury, but are still public bureaucrats and are still obligated to do things according to the Act, and almost were just purely part of the Treasury under the president, but for a intra-governmental bureaucracy fight over who has discretion over their own mandate. I hope that answers your question.
Dude, no. You know what? I'm just realizing that, you're just not that knowledgeable about this stuff. I can't even do it with a straight face.